welcome to today's video. And today's video is about Hawaii's only queen, first and only ever queen, who gave up her claim to the throne to protect and save her own people. Queen Lili'uokalani. My apologies if I'm not pronouncing that accurately. I would like to apologize. I mean, no disrespect. And the trials and tribulations that she went through, what subsequently happened, and everything that precipitated and led up to what ended up happening, which was her being overthrown and forced to abdicate. A lot happened to get to that point. So we're just going to be touching upon all that, but with a focus on the queen as much as I can. Hopefully I do her a little bit of justice. Okay, so like I mentioned before, Hawaii is where we are today. The absolutely drop-dead gorgeous, beauticious archipelago nation of Hawaii. The nation that's gone through quite a bit in recent history in terms of natural disasters and wildfires. It is the United States of America's only archipelago state. An island state of the United States of America that is about 2,000 miles from California. It was during Queen Lili'uokalani's reign and time period that Hawaii became part of US territory. How that came to be, that's a whole thing. Okay, sorry about the light change. The sun waits for no one. Am I recording? Oh, I guess I am. I guess I can. I guess I won't. I guess the fall. Anyway, yeah, so beautiful, beautiful, beautiful nation. Absolutely gorgeous. It's absolutely gorgeous and breathtaking. I watched a show called Hawaii 5-0 only for the scenic shots. I didn't watch it for the plot. Let's put it that way. I'm not knocking the show. Anybody who liked the show, nice show, lovely show, I'm sure. But yeah, I watched it for the scenic shots of Hawaii. And yeah, so aloha. Anyway, so the queen herself, she was born on the 2nd of September 1838 in Honolulu, Hawaii. And she was given the birth name of Lydia Kamakahea. I hope I'm pronouncing that accurately because I mean no disrespect. I'll refer to her as Lydia until the official royal name change that came when she became queen or when she was appointed as successor. She was one of 10 children. She was born to both parents of very high-ranking status and prominence. Her father's name was Kapakea and her mother's name was Lili'uokalani. Again, I hope I'm pronouncing that accurately. Her mom was the counselor to King Kamehameha III. Now, at the time, Kauai had a common custom and tradition whereby prominent high-ranking families, such as chiefs' families, etc., royal families, etc., would adopt and raise each other's children. So one child would go to one family and another would go to the next family, another would go to another family. It wasn't like exchanging each other's families such. It was just raising each other's families, more of a community thing than anything. And that includes Lydia's family as well. They adopted and raised children from other high-ranking family members, from other families also. This practice and custom was known as hanai or hanai. This was thought and said to strengthen or tie in the bonds between those high-ranking families, and in particular, their friendship ties between the chiefs. So, as part of this custom, Lydia, fresh out of her mama's womb, and I mean that, was adopted into another family. Her foster parents that raised her from birth, really, essentially. Her father was High Chief Paki and her mother was Konia. And they had, in terms of biological children, Lydia's foster parents, they had one other child. Her name was Bernice, and she was raised along with her in the family. So from now on, when I say her father, I'm going to be referring to her foster parents because that's the family that she knew the most. That was essentially, by all intents and purposes, her family that raised her. So when I say her father or her mother, when I'm talking about her parents, I'm going to be referring to them unless I state otherwise. So her father was a chief during King Kamehameha III's reign. King Kamehameha III was the longest ruling monarch in Hawaiian history. And under his rule, Hawaii went from being governed solely and outright by monarchy to being a constitutional monarchy. Britain, Sweden, Thailand, just to name a few, are a few other countries that operate under the same system or similar, a constitutional monarchy. And her mother was of royalty herself. She was the granddaughter of King Kamehameha I. So Lydia's great-grandfather Akbar founded the Kamehameha dynasty, and he also united all of the islands. Again, that's a whole thing in terms of why they had to be unified to begin with. A lot happened. A lot happened. History, essentially, yes, he was. It was under his rule that Hawaii islands became to be united and unified. Lydia had a very custom royal upbringing. At 4 years of age, she went to a missionary royal school, at the time known as Chief's Children's School. It was a boarding school specifically and exclusively established for royal children. So exclusive is the word indeed. She was one of 16 students to attend the boarding school, 5 of whom became the last 5 rulers of the Hawaiian kingdom. Lydia wrote a book. Lydia wrote a book after her time in the monarchy. She wrote a book about her experiences, and she talked about how strict they were at the boarding school, which I am not shocked because they tend to be, from my experience too. So in the school, they had American educators. Their American educators were forcibly insistent on them learning and speaking English in a particular way, and they heavily discouraged the students from speaking Hawaiian. So much so to the point that if they did not meet the expectations of the facilitators, they would be punished by being sent to bed without food. Mind you, 4 years of age is what we're talking about here. Again, this is like Lydia talking about her experiences in her book. But they were Hawaiian babies and natives from a nation that epitomized living off the land. So the children, as young as they were, a lot of them, as young as they were able to be resourceful and source their own meals during these times. Yeah, feeding themselves essentially. Boarding school, food issues, sounds familiar. She learned to fluently speak English and learned about poetry writing and had musical training as well whilst there. She retained her love of poetry and music her entire life. She ended up writing a lot of songs, about 150, 160 songs over the course of her life. And she's quoted as saying, composing came as naturally as breathing came to her. So that's innate talent indeed. So a little bit of a backstory that's pertinent to Lydia's legacy, that's vital or important to mention. Quite possibly, like without this part of history, quite possibly Hawaii would have had a different history. I mean, it's all relative, but like things would not have ended up the way they did. And that includes her being overthrown from the crown and the annexation of the island itself by America. So we'll go back a few years before Lydia was born. We'll go back a few years. We meet Queen Kahumanu. Queen Kahumanu. Through marriage, she married a king. She's instrumental in shaping Hawaiian history and what would become Hawaii as we know it today, I think, for the most part. I think she had a part to play in that, like a huge part. So she was married to Kamehameha, Lydia's great-grandfather. Queen Kahumanu's husband had 16 or 17 other wives along with her, as was very common practice back then, and some nations refused to give that up. That is not a judgment, that is just a statement. But it said that Queen Kahumanu remained his favorite throughout their marital union. She was his favorite, so much so that the king appointed her as his successor's guardian. So somebody who was to become king after the king himself, he appointed her as the guardian to that person. And that person happened to be his son. And he allowed her to attend his high council meetings, which was something that no women were allowed to do. And she was even able to take her father's place on the council after he had passed on. So her father passed away. She was able to take his place and his position on the high council. Again, something that no women were allowed to do. She was the first to do any of this. She definitely had a lot of pull. It said that though the king and the queen's marriage was not without its strifes, of course. Nothing is smooth sailing on earth. It was highly contentious and challenged, but they remained together until the king's passing, which was in 1819 when the king passed away. At which point his son, King Kamehameha II, ascended the throne, and Queen Kahumanu as co-ruler, essentially. The new king was still of young age in terms of wisdom and experience. Yeah, he was 22 at the time. Yes, her counsel was very much a thing. So yes, her being there, I'm sure would have provided a sense of security, for a lack of a better word that I can't think of. Queen Kahumanu had a tremendous amount of sway and influence on him as a king. So much so that when the king and his 2 wives, yes, he was 22 and he had wives, So much so that when the king and one of his wives went to London due to royal obligations, Queen Kahumanu was made regent in his absence. She was fully in charge. Typically, whoever was made regent, like historically speaking, in terms of people who are or were made regents, were the people who were to be successors to the throne. So she was not named a successor to the throne, yet she was named regent and tasked with ruling and leading in his absence, in the king's absence. So yes, a big deal. Like, genuinely, I'm leaving quite a lot out of here. So much transpired in this time period, like including the outlawing of human sacrifice. But one that is pertinent to this story, it's all pertinent, there's levels. One that is germane to the story was the acceptance of missionaries, New England Protestant missionaries, their acceptance in Hawaii. The Queen was instrumental in arguing for their stay, as it said that she yearned for a different way of life. Yeah, so I guess she wanted an end to a lot, but mostly the, men having multiple wives element of things, the debaucheryness of it all. And the missionaries' teachings brought an end to that. The missionaries were allowed to settle on the islands purely because the Queen took to their teachings. As a result, the missionaries were allowed to settle on the islands. The Queen herself was extremely open and really took to their teachings and their word. As a result, from them being allowed to settle and the Queen giving a seal of approval for them, the missionaries' teachings really began to disseminate and shape the cultural, educational, and spiritual landscape of Hawaii. It's said that the king himself learned to speak and write English within like a 2-year span from the missionaries' arrival. Before the arrival of the missionaries, the native Hawaiians did not have written language. Instead, they had or used oral tradition and hula for the passage of generational culture and identity. It's said that the king, who was described as impulsive at times, was hesitant in fully allowing for the missionaries to settle in Hawaii, as it would have brought an end, or at least brought into question, his love for a good tipple, and he would have had to give up his multiple wives. But safe to say, the Queen won out in this one. These missionaries had quite a lot of access to the royals and the monarchy. Unprecedented, really. They had an incredible amount of influence on the Hawaiian kingdom, thus affecting policy. And these missionaries arrived in Hawaii in 1820. I think that was the first time that they were allowed to settle was 1820. So a year after the king's passing. Genuinely, there's so much more to this rich Hawaiian tapestry of history. But the main point being, it was these missionaries that were running the chief's children's school that were responsible and tasked with educating royal children, a school that Lydia attended. It started with Queen Kahumanu allowing and really pushing for them to be allowed to settle and their teachings to shape Hawaiian culture. Before the missionaries, Hawaii was governed by the kapu system. So I think by today's standards, Queen Kahumanu would be considered a progressive figure in terms of her views and what she pushed for, as she abolished or helped abolish a lot of Hawaii's traditional laws and customs for Christian laws and system beliefs. Very, very influential lady. So I brought it up because, again, had she not allowed for those settlers to arrive and settle, had she not been pushing and advocating for them to settle so much, my point is, those people ended up educating Lydia in boarding school, where she learned a lot. Who knows? She probably would have been the musician that she ended up being anyway, but we'll never know. As Kanye West said, they wanted to know how I would react if I didn't win. Guess we'll never know. I'm not advocating for that man because he's weird and crazy now. Take your meds, bro. Anyway, yes, so Lydia went to that school that was run by missionaries. Queen Kahumanu advocates for missionaries. Ergo, missionaries end up educating and running a school for young royals. And one of those royals is our heroine of the story, Lydia. Lydia herself described herself as a studious student. Yes, back to Lydia now. And as part of her education, she also traveled and taught the Western world. Touring the Western world was a rite of passage for young royals. So in 1848, when Lydia was 10 years of age, there was an epidemic that took hold of Hawaii. A measles outbreak. I should say it was epidemics that hit Hawaii, as whooping cough and influenza cases were also taking hold during this exact time period. And these diseases ended the lives of thousands of natives, 1/10 of the population to be exact. So truly, truly tragic. It's thought or said, actually, it's said that, actually, it's written. It's said that specifically the measles outbreak was brought to Hawaiian waters by an American warship from Mexico, and this warship was making a 1-month visit to the islands, whereas whooping cough arrived from a ship from California. Hawaiians were tough, resilient, and very, very healthy people that had been living in somewhat of a bubble, all before these ships hit their shores with these diseases. And unfortunately, these diseases decimated the island that had been largely isolated and had not been exposed to these outside illnesses. There was also smallpox, leprosy, influenza, though I mentioned it before, and STIs, etc., that devastated the nation in following years. Again, due to influx of foreigners coming into the country and the nation. I will touch upon in terms of why that happened a little bit after. But specifically, the measles outbreak hit really close to home for Lydia, as she lost a lot of close friends and family members that she'd known her whole life. Very, very sad indeed. Like, she lost a lot of very, very close people to her due to the measles outbreak. She said that this awful and horrific event left a great impression upon her younger years, as she had to watch all those close relatives and friends be buried on the same day. Quite a visceral event to witness and experience, I imagine. The royal school that Lydia had attended and was attending was also hit and affected by these outbreaks, diminishing in influence, and ended up ceasing operations a couple of years after that, give or take. Side note, that school, the Chief's Children's School, was later renamed the Royal School, and today it is in operation under the name Royal Elementary School. Lydia was, after the school closing, Lydia was then sent to another school, which was also run by missionaries, but this one was a day school, not a boarding school, and she was considerably much happier there. In 1855, at the age of 17 years of age, she sadly lost her father, Paki, and in 1857, just 2 years after that, she also lost her mother, Gonia. Both of her parents would sadly not witness their daughter's engagement in 1859 and eventual marriage later on to Mr. Dominus in 1862, at the age of 24 years of age. Lydia's fiance and eventual husband, Mr. John Owen Dominus, was American born with Italian heritage to a father who was a sea captain, and he had moved his family from the United States of America, from Boston, I believe. He had moved his family from America, from the US to Hawaii in 1837, so a year before Lydia was born. John, Lydia's future fiance husband, John, as a youngster himself, had attended a school that was right next to the royal boarding school that Lydia had attended. And it said that he would talk to all the children of nobility through the fence, and he made friends with them that way. Hence how he met his future wife, Lydia, through a fence. As a grown-up, John worked as a clerk/banker in San Francisco for a period of time before going back to Hawaii again and working in the same field for Honolulu Commercial House. He then worked as King Kamehameha IV's secretary before becoming King Kamehameha the fifth's staffing team. And apparently him and the fifth king had a very, very close friendship. When Lydia and John got married, they moved into John's mother's house with John's mother, where she had been residing in her home. John's mother, a widow at that point, as she'd lost her husband, wasn't exactly warm and welcoming, Lydia had said, going as far as calling Lydia an intruder. Oof. I'd imagine Lydia probably had to bite her tongue on a number of occasions just to keep the peace. So yes, John's mother, Lydia's mother-in-law, did not want anybody getting in between her and her son's relationship and only child. 2 of her other children had actually passed away whilst in America, like back in America. There were 2 older daughters. They had passed away at the age of 13 years of age. She had lost 2 other children before. John was an only child remaining. So you can kind of understand the possessiveness, I guess, in a way. You can kind of understand why she kind of clung on to her only son and only family left in that sense. But Lydia did say that her mother-in-law did soften towards her. She became more tender and affectionate as her days were drawing to a close. So that's something, at least. So yeah, that aside though, Lydia hinted in her book that her marriage was not necessarily that one of a happy one at times. This is further supported by the fact that Lydia's husband ended up fathering a child with one of Lydia's servants. But of course, being the benevolent person and wonderful person that she is, Lydia would go on to officially adopt the child as her own in later years after Dominus's passing. They actually would adopt, in the marriage itself, they would adopt two other children under the Hanai custom, but they never had any biological children of their own. In 1866, Lydia was approached by the king at the time to compose a national anthem for Hawaii, and she did so successfully, and her anthem was used for the following 20 years until it was nationally decided that it needed to change. In 1874, Lydia's brother, take two. So in 1874, Lydia's brother, David Kalakaua, became and was named as the King of Hawaii. This was her blood brother from her birth parents. Anyway, he became king after a contentious election result. Again, that's another whole part of history, what happened with that election. But I'm trying to keep it as pertinent to Lydia's story as possible. Anyway, a little interesting fact relating to King Kalakaua. So, as is customary with royals and the monarchy nowadays, back then it was less so. That is for a sitting monarch to go on a world tour across the nations. Yeah, so in 1881, King David embarked on a world tour that saw him going to Europe, Asia, Africa, specifically Egypt in Africa, and the US. On his US leg of the tour, he met with Thomas Edison. A meeting was set up with Thomas Edison. The point is, he requested that he wanted to meet with Thomas Edison whilst in the US, and they met up in New York, and the meeting was to discuss possibly having or bringing electricity to Honolulu, Hawaii. A few years after that, which would be 1866, the king got his wish. The king's palace, Lili'uokalani Palace, was lit up with electricity. The palace received electricity 5 years ahead of the US White House. They got that on them, so yeah, I thought that was quite interesting. King David had a tremendous interest in modernizing the monarchy and modernizing his nation. Hence why he requested that meeting with Thomas Edison and how best to serve his people. He was just generally interested in modern science at the time, and yeah, so he made that happen. And they both, well, everybody involved made it happen. But anyway, upon ascending the throne, King David chose his younger brother, Prince William Pitt, to be his successor to the throne. But unfortunately, the young prince died before ever taking to the throne. The young prince died in 1877 due to contracting rheumatic fever. King David then had to find or name another successor to the throne. He didn't have any children of his own, and his younger brother had just passed away. He named Lydia as his successor to the throne. And upon this, he bestowed her the title of Princess Lili'uokalani. I hope I'm pronouncing that accurately. So King David, Princess Lili'uokalani, and Prince William Pitt, their younger brother that passed away, they all had shared a love of music and poetry. And no doubt that this was a devastating loss for both of them. That same year that they lost their younger brother, Princess Lili'uokalani penned her widely known song, Aloha Oe. Beautiful, beautiful voice. I listened to that song. Absolutely gorgeous voice and beautiful song. In 1875, Lydia witnessed the signing of the Reciprocity Treaty, something she was vehemently against and opposed to. She witnessed the signing of this treaty by King David as part of trying to further modernize Hawaii. What this treaty was a free trade agreement between US and Hawaii. It allowed for products, mainly sugar, to be imported to the US without tariff charges. Free trade. Part of that agreement was that Hawaii was not allowed to offer or grant other nations similar privileges or allow for the leasing of their harbors and ports by other nations. So yes, Princess Lili'uokalani was very much opposed to this. In 1881, Crown Princess Lili'uokalani was made regent when the king embarked upon another world tour, as part of his royal obligations, that is, of course. During her time as queen in waiting, she traveled the world, met with foreign dignitaries, and she kept in touch with her people by making various trips around the nation of Hawaii. So it seems like she had her pulse. She very much had a pulse on what her people wanted, needed, or were asking for. In 1884, she also found out that the Reciprocity Treaty was renewed, upheld, amended, I'm going to say renewed and amended, to include the US obtaining exclusive rights to enter and establish a naval base in Hawaii, Pearl Harbor. The rest is history. So a little bit of vital information regarding the missionaries and their settlement and them just shaping the cultural landscape of Hawaii. I don't know, and just some of the things that ended up transpiring once they were allowed to settle in Hawaii. So remember I said that they had a lot of influence over the monarchy, even being entrusted with educating the royal children and running a lot of the schools that were tasked with educating the elite, so to speak. A lot of tradition and laws were abolished due to the missionaries settling in Hawaii. So with that in mind, their influence over the monarchy and what they were able to achieve in terms of being entrusted in being trusted with a lot of establishments, they managed to convince the Hawaiian nation and the monarchy that it was in their best interest, like it was in the nation's best interest to allow that to happen. Okay, so in 1840, these American missionaries and American advisors, they helped the king and the chief to devise a new constitution. It was Hawaii's first constitution. A year after they'd helped the king and these chiefs devise Hawaii's first constitution, the sugarcane production ramped up. It's said that the locals and the natives were not particularly pleased or happy about that because of the production, like sugarcane production, because of the production's adverse effect on the natural landscape. But nonetheless, the Hawaiians did work in these plantations. Sugarcane requires a lot of water. It requires a lot of resources. Yeah, and a lot of labor as well. Whilst the natives were somewhat reticent to these agreements, they did end up working in the plantations. And it said that sadly, they were heavily mistreated though by the plantation owners and everybody in charge. They were heavily mistreated as far as working conditions go, leading to a significant number of them leaving the workforce. But the plantation owners were not deterred. The plantation owners began to recruit foreign labor, and they recruited from the Philippines, from Korea, from China, from Japan, recruited the Portuguese too. Now, as time went on, the number of foreign laborers would exceedingly dwarf the number of natives in the following years. And that fact was not helped by the fact that many natives were dying in huge numbers due to the illnesses being brought to Hawaii. It said that Hawaiian natives, their numbers went from 300,000 in the late 1700s, early 1800s to 70,000 in 1855. So that's a drastic decline. Again, missionary influence here. In 1848, the Kingdom of Hawaii was somewhat under pressure to overhaul its land ownership system, or just its land system in general. For the overhauling of the system was as follows. It was threefold. Rights were acquired through a hierarchy of land giver/tenant relationship. Then from higher to lesser chiefs to local land supervisors. And then to the commoners. Very much at the bottom of all that were the everyday common natives of Hawaii. This was not ownership though. Eviction was always a looming threat. So the king, wanting to modernize the land system with the advice of the American advisors, the Land Redistribution Act was enacted, and it was called the Great Mahele. Hawaiian land was divided into thirds. 1/3 of the land was given to government, 1/3 was given to the chiefs, and 1/3 for the ownership of its native people. The law itself opened up land ownership for the first time ever. For this to happen, for the natives to be able to own land, the natives had to file claims within 2 years of the law passing, and also pay some fees for land titles. But a lot of the natives failed to file the claims, partly because of their unfamiliarity with the system, and a lot of them because they did not know that they needed to or had to. With the natives not filing claims to ownership of the lands, the American businessmen, advisors, all of them were able to take advantage of the situation. They filed claims to all those unclaimed lands, with them outright owning all of that land or all those lands. And then from that, the sugarcane plantations grew exponentially. So yeah, whilst all of this is happening, the exchange of power within the monarchy and all of that from the 1820s onwards, whilst all of this is happening, in the backdrop of all of this is American and European at times, but majority American businessmen and missionaries who wanted to make profit from what the land of Hawaii could offer, and this foreign influence and interest in Hawaiian land, whilst fulfilling their self-interest. Money. Like I'd said before, then I was mentioning the treaty. The treaty was linked to all of that because it gave those businessmen that had those lands exponentially more wealth. So these missionaries and businessmen with land ownership benefited from this system, and this reciprocity treaty far more than any natives ever did. So back to Lydia now. In 1887, Princess Lili'uokalani and the king's wife, King David's wife, that is, they attended Queen Victoria's Jubilee in London as representatives of Hawaii. In attendance was also President Grover Cleveland. He will come up later. Whilst the princess or queen-in-waiting was at the Jubilee in Britain, a secret cabal of landowners and white businessmen with the backing of militia marched to King David with the force and threat of violence. They forced him to sign a new constitution, the Bayonet or Bayonet Constitution, a new constitution that completely stripped the monarchy of its powers and transferred those powers to these men. Since the initial entry of the American missionaries, a steady stream of European and American had been slowly gaining control and land over time. A scammy tactic that these people used was to use the illnesses and diseases they introduced to cast aspersions on natives, on Hawaiian natives, by labeling them as unclean and unhealthy for having these diseases and illnesses. These businessmen then would use these narratives to further their objectives and help justify their entrenched control over the nation. Crown Princess Lili'uokalani was actively opposed to all of this happening, all of it. She opposed the Reciprocity Treaty and the new constitution, the Bayonet Constitution. Her stance put her in opposition, like in direct opposition with these businessmen. So yeah, she was already not in favor with them long before she ever ascended the throne. In 1891, the king passed and Queen Lili'uokalani was now the Queen of Hawaii. So first order of business, apart from organizing her cabinet, that is, and everything else bureaucratic, she did a royal tour with her husband. She did a royal tour of the islands. Reportedly, her husband actually had not been feeling well. He was like suffering from the effects of rheumatic fever, but nonetheless he came along on the tour with her anyway. The tour itself went well. She was pleasantly surprised and pleased at how well received she was by her people. The queen and the consort, that's the title he officially got. Queen and the consort, they were hosted by various notable people in their travels for staying the night, and when they were not staying in palaces across the nation or places designated for royalty travel or royal travel across the nation. She said that herself she was really well and truly grateful for everybody's hospitality that she came across. On one of the mornings, whilst she was preparing for the day ahead, she noticed that her husband was unable to get out of bed, and unfortunately he only got weaker and weaker as time went on, until his passing sometime after, with the queen right by his side until his very last breath. And he passed within 7 months of the queen ascending the throne, so very shortly into her reign as queen. She spoke about how this affected her. Of course, I mean, obviously, which we can all imagine, rough time indeed. But queen of the people that she was not to be deterred, though. She drew from inner strength, and I think she was aware that it was not going to be an easy tenure for her reign at all. But she set about representing her people and reclaiming or restoring a lot of what had been lost, specifically because of the businessmen. Specifically because of businessmen influence in Hawaiian politics and everything, really. A lot happened within her reign, like in the beginning months of the reign, like in the beginnings and throughout, but a lot happened during this period, specifically for the queen. There was a lot of political infighting amongst the political parties, also her attempts to form a balanced cabinet. She was just at every turn getting pushback from these businessmen, so they were never going to allow her to do as she pleased or as she saw fit for her people. But on top of that list of things for her to restore was the undoing of the Bayonet Constitution. And in 1893, she declared a new constitution to do just that. And in response to her doing so, I should say, a group of American, European businessmen again, mostly American businessmen. A group of these plantation owners and businessmen, led at the helm by Sanford Dole, who was a son of American missionaries that had settled in Hawaii. Sanford Dole was cousins with James Dole of the Dole Food Company. Anyway, yeah, so a group of these men, led by Sanford Dole, they were claiming to be representing or be representative of business interests of the island, when in reality it was nothing but self-interest. A group of these men sought to remove the queen from power. Yeah, so they sought to remove her from power, declaring themselves as provisional government. They asked the US Navy for help, stating that the queen had created general alarm and terror. The US then sent troops to Hawaii. Yes, they staged a coup d'etat. So, like I said, she was already not in favor with any of these men way before she ever took to the throne, because she was seen as a threat to their business interests. So as a result of this coup d'etat, the queen surrendered though. But she was not giving up. Far from it. She planned on appealing to President Grover Cleveland of the United States of America to assist in overturning or putting a stop to the coup d'etat. So she did this, and she had the following to say: "The present constitution is full of defects, as the Chief Justice here will testify, as the question have come so often before him for settlement. It is so faulty that I think a new one should be granted. I have prepared one in which the rights of all have been regarded, a constitution suited for the wishes of the dear people. But with regret, I say I have met with obstacles that prevented it." So she did appeal to the President Grover Cleveland, and the US president offered her reinstatement under the condition that she would forgive or pardon all the parties that were involved in the coup d'etat, a condition that she reluctantly agreed to, but nonetheless eventually agreed to. Mr. Sanford Dole and his cronies, businessmen, rejected and denied all of that. They were not going to allow for the queen to be reinstated. So they simply ignored President Grover Cleveland. And with that, the provisional government was now declared the Republic of Hawaii, and Mr. Dole as the first ever president of Hawaii. And just like that, the Hawaiian monarchy was overthrown from power. American imperialism. Sometime after that, a Mr. Wilcox, I think his name was Robert. Sometime after that, Mr. Wilcox tried to get the queen reinstated as the crown queen and get her reinstated back on the throne, and he did so by trying to and leading an insurrection that unfortunately was unsuccessful, but it had a lot of support from natives. So as a result of this failed insurrection, the queen was placed under arrest and was charged with treason. What? And the queen, to protect all those people that had taken part in the insurrection, she agreed to formally abdicate under the condition that no harm shall come upon her supporters. Her supporters had been taken and been arrested and had been threatened with execution. Benevolent queen that she was, she simply could not let that happen, especially to her people, and she gave up her power and her throne for their lives. In 1896, she traveled together with her niece that she'd named as her successor. They traveled to the US to see President Grover Cleveland again, and once more appeal to him. And as sympathetic as he was to the situation, there was no success. No success. The next president was even less sympathetic, if at all. Actually, I don't know. I don't think he was at all, by the sounds of it. And he saw the opportunities for his nation, US, for his nation in the whole situation in Hawaii. That's the whole thing, because Hawaii ended up being annexed. These businessmen and all of these people, they ended up offering Hawaii to the United States of America. Oh, honestly, a lot happened. It's a whole thing, but essentially Hawaii ended up being part of US territory because of all of this, due to the queen being overthrown from power, and yes, these businessmen forming their own government and being the government of Hawaii, governing over Hawaiians who the majority of were very much against. They were not for any of this. They were for their monarchy to remain ruling over their nation. But that did not seem to matter to a lot of these people. So yes, there was very little left for the queen to do. She ended up retiring from public life and lived her life until she passed from a stroke in 1917 at the age of 79 years of age. She fought for her people's rights through and believed in her nation and them retaining their rights, and much respect to her for going up against these very powerful men. And yeah, may she rest in peace. So yes, an awesome lady, so may she rest in peace.